Well, good morning, folks. As we enter week two, I'm going to do this. I have this brain chart I'm put together to talk about the operating environment versus the implementing environment, or if you have a strategic initiative that you're trying to implement something new. One of the things I've seen over the years, and I've seen it consistently, I still see it today. I've seen it over the last 40 years since out of business school. And one thing I've not seen change is that very good, well-run companies tend to understand that you cannot have an operating environment and an implementing or executing environment run side by the same people. In other words, a company has a new strategic initiative and it tends to have the same people attempt to implement a new strategic initiative while running the day-to-day business operations or the operating environment. Typically, what you're going to find happen when you attempt that is that individuals will let the operating environment take over the implementing environment, the day-to-day operations, which is typical, where you have customers, you have demands on the day-to-day operation. And ultimately, I've found that it just never works, that you need a dedicated team of individuals to work on the new strategic initiative as you have the operating environment still operating, because you can't just shut your business down. When companies don't do that, when they try to have people do double duty, if you will, it is almost always, in my opinion, in my experience, led to failure, either suboptimal strategic implementation or total failure. Both empirical evidence and my own consulting experiences over the last 40 years, which suggests here are some of the leading causes of failure of strategy execution. There's a lack of knowledge of the strategy process, what strategy is and what the process is. There's no commitment to the plan. This is surprising to me, that you would implement something and then not drive the commitment down through, or at least, I shouldn't say drive is probably the wrong word. You need to engender commitment through the plan. You need to bring people in. You have to explain to them. You have to get them on board. And companies don't do that. Either they just don't take the time to explain it. The people are willing, they just don't understand it, or they don't. There is a lack of commitment because people don't buy the plan, because companies don't sell it. You have to sell your plan to the troops. You can't just, ordain it from on high and this will happen because you're the CEO. You have to take that plan and sell it and get commitment through the ranks. The plan, therefore, is not communicated effectively. People are not measured or rewarded for executing a plan. This is one where, again, if you see people doing double duty, your reward is based on your productivity for the year. Well, and all of a sudden, well, would you do me a favor and put this plan in place? You have 40 to 50 hours to do your day-to-day job, and when you got nothing else to do, in the other 40 to 50, I'll put the strategic initiative in place. And of course, you're not rewarded for it, but you actually may be penalized, which is the worst of all worlds, right? That I'm not rewarded for doing a good job in the initiative, but I will be penalized for it, and I might also get penalized for my day-to-day activities because I'm doing double duty. The plan is too abstract. People can't relate it to their own work. You've got to be able to take it and make it a tangible, concrete benefit to the company and the individuals using it. If it's too abstract, they're not going to understand it. People are not held accountable for the execution. That's just the flip side, is that there has to be some accountability for the execution. But again, part of this, and what you should see through all of this, is there has to be some fairness. You have to understand the capabilities, the bandwidth, and construct and build your execution teams in a fair manner. Senior managers do not have to pay attention to the plan. Again, they develop this, and they say, okay, the troops go put it in, and they go off to do something else, and they're not paying attention, which means, of course, it leads to a strategy that's not clear, focused, or consistent. Conditions change, making the plan as conceived obsolete. So you may have a plan, but change can come out of nowhere. I mean, God knows, we only know this now with COVID. That strategy execution plans could be obsolete in a day, depending on the level of the shock to the system. If it's currently, again, an enormous shock, external shock delivered by COVID has changed many a business plan. The proper control systems not in place to measure and track the execution. In other words, again, we're putting in it, but you've got to measure. Are we doing a good job or a bad job? And again, that's not to hold people accountable, penalize them. But, you could be people could be working very hard and not doing a good job because we have no measurement in place. How do we know it's working? The culture, the strategic process, the IT systems, and the HR systems are not aligned. Now, this may not mean too much, but by week 3, this certainly should mean to you because we're going to talk about the 7 S's, and you will look at this week also the 7 S's. I believe it's in this week's readings also. That if as you drive your initiative through the system and work to get it in place, if the systems aren't aligned, what you're going to have is inconsistency. And go back to the concept of strategy. You need to integrate and align your strategy initiatives or all your choices, if you will. If they are not aligned, not integrated properly, then you are not going to have a successful initiative, and that becomes critical. And you've got to understand what new alignments mean. And finally, if your folks are driven by short-term results, and if they are not aligned with long-term results, and there are both reward systems are not aligned with reward systems, and the mentality the corporation is got to, if it has a short-term mentality, then of course a strategic initiative is going to be a disaster if it implemented. So companies with very long-term goals and long-term objectives tend to do far better in a new strategic initiative, implementing it. Well, here are some real other pitfalls. One of them is past in the habits. People fall back to the past, and they have habits, and habits are very hard to break. Good habits, of course, allow a corporation to do very well, but sometimes when those good habits are just no longer relevant, you've got to change them. Very hard to do. Economic climate or the budget, can change. Again, we see that now. Company culture can be very resistant to change, and and again, we're going to see this. The stronger the culture, the harder it is to change. Company culture can be very, very beneficial. However, strong cultures can be detrimental when the time is needed to change the culture, and that can be really challenging. The way companies work together, they can be challenging. Again, if you have not integrated or aligned all your systems appropriately. Your senior management team can be somewhat challenged if they're not in line. And then customers can be highly resistant to change if it's not seen to benefit them. And that's really where the company, if the senior management and those in charge of dealing with customer relations haven't done a good job selling it, it can be a problem. Well, just some brief definitions. The operating environment, that's the day-to-day operations designed to meet existing operational requirements. The implementing environment or the strategic environment is driving strategic change. Both environments must coincide with the minimum of disruption to the existing business operation, and that is the central challenge. How do we change the business environment or the business operating environment, while we're driving the bus? So it's a little like driving the bus down the highway at 50 miles an hour, and we need to change a couple of tires while we're still driving. And that is a very, very challenging part of business. And good companies understand it and are able to pull it off. Companies that are not quite so well run have a very difficult time with this. Well, here are some of the key elements of strategic initiatives. First, strategic leadership. Identifying the critical strategic initiative. This can't be outsourced. You can't give this to a consultant. And this is where I think particularly I've seen companies fail miserably because they bring in consultants and essentially give up their strategic initiatives or what they believe they need to do to the consultants without really questioning it and listening wholeheartedly, without really thinking deeply about their own business. And I'm a bit of a cynic on this one, but I think you need to run your own company. Now, sometimes you need some outside help, but that should be basically, in my opinion, good strategy consulting isn't doing the work for you. They're helping you get there, but they're not doing it. That has to come from internally to the company. Competent and dedicated teams. In other words, you need really good people. Again, and I've seen this a couple of times to the tremendous detriment, is that companies say, okay, we're going to put a new strategic initiative. We need you to assign staff, and they'll be dedicated. So they knew enough to have dedicated staff. But then what you find is that managers are using this to get rid of their excess baggage. I don't want this employee anymore. Can't get rid of them. They may not be in the best interest of my department, in my opinion. So what do? I send them off to this dedicated team, and all of a sudden, getting rid of the excess baggage in your organization. Then what you end up is a pretty poor strategic team, or at least parts of it that are weak. Active leadership. Leaders need to support, coach these execution teams. They have to hold them accountable, assessing and mitigating risks. Now, by accountability, I mean that they need to understand these teams have to do the job, of course, but they also have to be, when they run into pitfalls, you're not going to do the job for them, but you also need to advise them. You need active leadership. You must be involved in the day-to-day operations of both the operating environment and the strategic environment to oversee what's going on, because companies or teams will run into problems and they can get themselves hung up if they don't have the power to make the change, or they sometimes just need advice. That's when active leadership becomes critical. This is an example of a driving initiative, strategic initiative using project teams, which is how I favor it. I've seen it done a number of times. I've seen it done very successfully. I'm going to go through an example of McDonald's in a few seconds, but this is just one way of thinking about how to drive strategic initiatives through the organization in an organized manner with the appropriate resources to succeed. Now, McDonald's was the quintessential company that got themselves in trouble, and I've used this example in many classes before in the 90s, and they had done pretty much all the wrong things from a strategic initiative standpoint. Their stock was just crashing. Their customers did not like them. Their food quality was poor, their service was poor, and the cleanliness of the stores were poor. So if you think about their value proposition, which was consistent quality food with good, solid service in a clean environment, basically their strategic value proposition was not being lived up to. They cost reduced their products over the years, and it had really hurt the store, and it tried to drive more profits. And if you can see there I think it was in 03, their stock had gone down to like $14 a share or something like that. There was actually some, they weren't probably in danger of exactly going out of business, but as one senior executive told me, this was a guy who was way up in the corporation. He was one of the guys that drove this change, told me. He said, when we started to drive the new change, at that point, prior to that, we did not have a sellable franchise model anymore. We could not sell it. It was not an ongoing concern. We were in so much trouble, and that's when they made these changes. What drove their changes? Well, the first thing is they brought in a new CEO, and this CEO had come up from the ranks, literally started flipping burgers, and he knew the business cold, and he was a very well thought of. Unfortunately, I believe he died of cancer within a couple of years of turning the company around, which is very sad. But he came up and began to drive the business. He unearthed all the old recipes because they had cost reduced the products so badly, particularly the burgers and fries. They tasted like crap. Essentially, they went back and they brought the old recipes and brought the food back to where it had been under the days of Ray Kroc in the 50s and in the 60s. He brought in new training systems and new technology, and they kept that going. That technology has been driven for almost 20 years after that. The 18 years they've been driving new technology. It was a massive revamp of their physical stores. They cleaned up their physical plant. All this meant to drive back to the company back to its initial value proposition. So if you think about what the value proposition was, they weren't delivering on it. So they weren't creating and delivering in support of the value proposition. All these initiatives I'm talking about here are what was meant to return them so they could create and deliver value in a manner that lived up to the value proposition. So they did have a question of, can they fix the core and then also grow via new products? Coffee being one of them. Coffee is a very powerful tool. Most companies should have lived in fear of them, Starbucks being one of them, although they have a very different model and a very different target model, but they still could have penalized or at least cannibalized some of their business. And McDonald's did a very good job with this. So they had asked the question, was it consistent with their value proposition? Because the old coffee that McDonald's used to serve was one of those, if you'd have to go back many years, but it was a pot of coffee they left on for the day. And at the end of the day, if you bought it later in the day, it just tasted horrible. McDonald's brought in new coffee, new making, and really did a very good job with it. Could they create value? Could they capture value? And sure, would coffee fit the business model? Well, of course, the answer was eventually yes, and that's what became their breakfast model, which has been very beneficial for them, and at times has almost helped them survive, really. It was their whole breakfast business that really helped turn the business around, the overall McDonald's franchise business around. Well, this is how they rolled coffee out, but they did this now. This template has been used for everything. This is how they've driven out technology. They've driven out new products. They've driven new store revamping, new training, all those things. This is all the model they basically used. What they did was they had these strategic initiatives, but they backed it by support staff. So McDonald's line staff, they pulled people out of the line. Now, their job was no longer to be frontline managers the way they were. They were champions of the technology, the new products. So the franchisees in the company stores weren't expected to do this all by themselves. McDonald's had these staff members, these line managers that knew the business cold. These guys, the men and women, had been in the stores most of their career. So the people behind this that were in charge of driving these initiatives had 15, 20 years in the business. And then they had tremendous vendor support behind that. And so these were dedicated people who, over the years, both the technology, the coffee, all these rollouts, they rolled them out over 3, 4, 5 years. So they were realistic that this was not something you were going to get done, decide on Monday and have it done on Wednesday. They had a very long-term plan. They rolled it across the country. They tested it. They found some things worked, some didn't because of different parts of the country. So they evaluated it as they went. But the key was they did not expect the day-to-day operating staff of these stores to do the job while they were also trying to roll out a new initiative. They had tremendous McDonald's Corporation. It dedicated tremendous support staff to help these initiatives and put them into the store, help implement them in the stores one by one, and again with a very realistic rollout period. Well, finally, here's some of the key takeaways. Companies continue to make some of these mistakes. Absent trained managers with knowledge of strategy execution. You have to have a dedicated set of managers and staff that truly understand the strategy execution is different from the operating environment and have the ability and the time and the resources to put in a strategic initiative, to drive that strategic initiative into the organization, through the organization. And by drive, I don't mean force fit it. I mean build it in a consistent manner while not disrupting or at least minimizing the disruption to the existing operating environment. All the positive and negative examples that I've talked about in the 90s are often being repeated. Unfortunately, I see it in clients in Europe. Astonishingly, some of these are very large, successful multinationals, and you're seeing what I see is that companies, the vast majority of companies, by the way, still doing a pretty good job to a very, very good job. But I still see some very large companies what I thought would have, understood the difference between the operating environment and the executing environment. I'm guessing it's under pressure to keep the cost down because they need to keep the stock price up, and they're living the quarter to quarter environment. Do not dedicate the existing resources that they need, and that's very costly. In other words, that's the penny wise and pound foolish. I'm saving some money now, but it's going to cost me dearly in the end. Institutional memory is vital for organizational success. Build on your administrative heritage. Don't discard it. Don't lose it. Again, companies have a bad habit of when they get themselves in trouble, and we're in that environment right now with COVID. They come in and often will wipe out their middle management to save money. Unfortunately, when they do that, they also wipe out much of their institutional knowledge. So you have to be very careful about that. I understand costs are important. I understand companies have to cut costs, but to do it in a way with a scalpel versus an axe generally is a more refined way and better way for the company to do it. But sometimes in panic, companies will just wield the axe, and they will again that the benefit tends to be short term, but the pain associated with doing it incorrectly tends to be long term, and you'll pay for it in the end down the road somewhere in your strategic initiatives when you can't roll them out or you can't not only just have a new strategic initiative, but as the business returns, the economy becomes better. You can't then drive your business or increase your business because, again, you've lost some of your institutional memory by getting rid of some of those critical managers. And that has to do with the linkages. We're going to talk about that later in this course. But again, integration of all your key elements is critical. When you get rid of people, that integration that you need, that tacit knowledge that exists, tends to disappear. And that's part of the culture. That's the glue, the invisible glue that holds the organization together. So with that, I will look forward to seeing you on the boards this week, and hopefully you are enjoying the class so far, and we will chat during the week on the boards and wrap up at the end of the week. Take care now, folks.